You find a home that works. You arrange a viewing. Then you mention that your child will be living with you too. Suddenly the message comes back. The property is no longer available. Can a landlord still do that in England? As a blanket policy, usually not. Since the 1st of May 2026, landlords and letting agents generally cannot shut a family out simply because there are children involved. But there is an important exception. And this video is about exactly where that line sits. For years, adverts said it outright. No children, professionals only, adults only. And even when the advert stayed quiet about it, the policy came out the moment you mentioned a child, on the phone, or after a viewing was already booked. A lot of people assumed that was simply how renting worked, that a landlord could pick and choose for any reason at all, and a family with children was just less convenient. That assumption is now out of date, at least as a blanket rule. But it isn't simply a yes or a no. It genuinely depends on why. Here is the actual position. Under the Renters' Rights Act 2025, it is now against the law in England for a landlord or a letting agent acting for them to stop you inquiring about a property, viewing it or renting it simply because a child would live there with you, or even just visit. That covers children under 18, whether they would be living there full-time or just staying over. And it isn't only a blanket refusal at the door. A quieter policy, one designed to make families with children less likely to get the tenancy than everyone else, is caught too. This applies to the ordinary private rented sector in England, the tenancies most renters actually have. It works differently for social housing, for supported housing, and for lodging arrangements, which sit under separate rules. Now here is the part that makes this different from other kinds of housing discrimination. Unlike refusing someone for being on benefits, which has no such get-out, a landlord can restrict children from a property if they can show it is a proportionate way of achieving a genuine, legitimate reason. That is a real legal test. It is not an excuse, and it is not automatic. The reason has to be genuine, and it has to actually benefit someone, not just the landlord's bank balance. Wanting to save money, or simply preferring not to deal with families, is not a legitimate reason on its own. The kind of situations this might genuinely cover include a retirement development, certain student housing, a property that is genuinely unsafe for a young child in a way that can't reasonably be fixed, or a landlord meeting a real licensing or overcrowding requirement. But none of those are automatic. Being a retirement development or student housing doesn't hand a landlord a free pass. Every one of those situations still has to pass the same test on its own facts for that actual property. And even then, the restriction has to fit the actual problem. A safety concern that only really applies to a toddler doesn't necessarily justify turning away a family with a teenager. A landlord should also have considered whether there was a less restrictive way of dealing with the same concern. One narrow point on older insurance policies, because it can genuinely come up. If a landlord is tied to an insurance policy taken out before these rules began, one that required them to exclude children, that can give them a defense for now. But the exception ends when that older policy is renewed or ends, whichever happens first. For almost everyone house hunting today, it simply will not apply. So in practice, the test comes down to this. A landlord can still assess whether a specific property is genuinely unsuitable, genuinely unsafe, or subject to a real licensing condition for a specific household. What a landlord cannot do is simply prefer not to rent to families and dress that preference up as a policy. One of those is a targeted evidence judgment about a particular property. The other is exactly the blanket discrimination this law was written to stop. Here's how this tends to play out. This is an illustration, not a real case. A parent inquires about a flat. The advert doesn't mention families either way. They arrange a viewing. Then they mention their child. And the viewing is cancelled with a message that simply says the landlord doesn't accept children. No property-specific reason. No licensing condition, no safety concern, just a blanket no. Now compare that with a landlord who explains up front that a particular studio is genuinely too small under the overcrowding rules for a household that size, or that a licensing condition on the building limits who can live there. One of those is a bare refusal. The other is a specific evidenced reason tied to that actual property. So if this happens to you, screenshot the advert, save every message and email, write down the date and who you spoke to, the agent or the landlord. Ask in writing for the actual reason you were refused. If the answer is a blanket one, with nothing specific to that property, that is exactly what this law is aimed at. Report it to your local council. It's the council that enforces this, and they can fine a landlord or agent up to £7,000. That penalty is paid to the council, not to you. So this is about stopping the practice, not compensation. If you went through a letting agent, it's also worth checking whether they belong to a redress scheme. And get advice from Shelter or Citizens Advice, because whether a specific restriction is lawful can genuinely depend on the details. So, can a landlord still say no children in England? As a blanket policy, usually not. Not since May 2026, but it isn't absolute. In limited, genuine situations tied to a specific property, a restriction can still be lawful. The difference is whether there's a real reason behind it or just a preference dressed up as one. Have you ever been turned away or had a viewing cancelled once you mentioned your children? Tell me what happened in the comments. It might help someone else recognize the moment something isn't right. This has been Housing Crisis Guide UK.